This is Antithesis, your underground academic radio where the focus is on you. For those that are in the thick of it today, we know what you are living through. And for those that chose or were forced onto a different path, we know what it costs. We're here to be your companion and to help you reorient your compass a bit, to help make sense of it all. Thanks for being here. The opinions expressed here are my own and do not reflect those of my employer or any entity professionally affiliated with me. Topics in these podcasts will be familiar to many, if not all, within the academic and scientific communities, within institutions, industries, and employers of all kinds. Some of these topics may be of a highly sensitive nature to certain listeners, particularly those that have experienced or are experiencing them, and could trigger some emotions that are upsetting or distressing. I've created this space to speak openly about these topics with the broader goal of helping individuals cope, adjust, and adapt constructively to the many challenges at hand. With that said, thank you for joining me. Antithesis, Episode 1, Suffering. Okay, everybody, welcome. Thanks for being here. A couple weeks ago, I was able to participate in a career panel on a Zoom call with grad students, postdoctoral trainees, and some faculty from the University of Utah neurobiology department. It was a fantastic opportunity to share a bit in terms of science policy and opportunities and careers involving science policy. So I want to give a shout out to the University of Utah neurobiology department. Thanks for having me. It was a real great pleasure to be able to be there and provide my insights into my experience in the Washington, D.C. area, some of the things I've done with government agencies and sort of that interplay between science and policy, et cetera. So really meant a lot to me to be able to be that and participate with you. So on that note, neurobiology and neuroscience really does come to mind, specifically with the news that has come out from over the past week, and something that actually folks have been keeping an eye on for more than a year now, apparently. And it has rocked that community specifically, neurosciences and neurobiology, but little doubt it's reverberating through all the sciences, unfortunately. And so this has all become way too common and it's way too frequent. And we're hearing about a lot of related issues in academic science and engineering. And it really just comes down to fraud and falsification of data and, themes that hover around that. So in this podcast, I plan on covering, in this series, every topic imaginable and more. And the title of today's topic I figured might come sometime later again, but these are some critical things that I hope to share in support of folks that might tune into this, current and past scientists, and possibly others that might grow interested in this area. And again, these types of things are relevant in any workplace, but when it comes to the sciences and pursuing an understanding and truth of biology or other facets of the sciences, that's really, really important. So today, that word is suffering. I'm not going to cover the entire story and dig miles deep into it, but what we need to talk about here is, where you go from experiencing this firsthand, understanding what's going on in the scenario I describe, and parallel types of situations that we find ourselves in the workplace or in academia or elsewhere. For your reference, the individual's name is Eliezer Masliah. You spell his last name Masliah. Very well-renowned neuroscientist, neurobiologist, and physician. So he conducted research at the University of California, San Diego for many, many decades. And from that point and a lot of success, he moved along to become a very important figure at the National Institutes of Health. His background and the emphasis of his research was, ironically, a lot of the aspects of neurobiology that had become defective and proteins that play a role in that, specifically when it comes to disease, Parkinson's disease, Alzheimer's, et cetera. Masliah had published about 800 papers, roughly, on conditions that damage synapses, the connections or junctions between neurons. That made him one of the most cited scientists in the entire world. So his work focuses on a lot of different proteins, one of them called alpha-synuclein. And this protein has been found relevant to both diseases, essentially, and continues to influence basic science, applied research, and specifically things as important as, creating companies and creating drugs to try to treat these neurological defects. Falsification and essentially the fraudulent activities that he's accused of here are things like manipulating data and copying images and sort of reusing images, but also having images appear in more than one article and reusing those images later on. And once again, you can just get the idea that inappropriate manipulation of data and specific evidence from experiments and getting those things published can lead to a lot of problems and are a really big issue that we're not just facing, obviously, in this instance, but it's really wrote throughout so much of sciences and other disciplines as well. With that, the fact that I know individuals at the National Institutes of Health, and I know individuals even within that realm at the National Institutes of Health, speaking to scientists out at the University of Utah, having been involved in the scientific endeavors in this regard, it's a real temptation. People end up following this path for obviously a number of different reasons. And for the most part, emotions really get related to this, especially, well, number one, if you're caught, and that's one part of this conversation, but if you end up suffering because of a lot of these falsehoods that are being, propagated, and your research depends on it, your grants depend on it, your paper, all of your work depends on it, that obviously can lead to a lot of consternation. One of the themes I wanted to discuss today is really anger, how this impacts you, how this impacts everyone, and not just in neurobiology and neuroscience, but all of science, and even how the public looks at scientists and deals with these kinds of situations. You have mistrust in science and the people that are doing the science itself. How you end up crossing that border of ethics and how these can really impact lives, not just lives of scientists and the ones directly working with Masliah, but how that reverberates for an entire community is really important to discuss. And there are a tremendous amount of angry people. I mean, obviously very, very angry people. And whether it's going to be specifically within groups at National Institutes of Health, but throughout the government, throughout funding agencies, you don't have to be a neurobiologist to be upset by this. And you start thinking about patients with Parkinson's and patients with Alzheimer's at the same time, and I think everybody has the right to feel anger. So being angry, being upset, being incredibly frustrated at how this continues to propagate over and over is an emotion that people have to have. I want to bring something in terms of taking that anger and sort of turning it around. I've watched clips of Masliah present, some recently, some several years ago, giving these presentations and witnessing as these flowery, long descriptions and really worshiping the efforts and the hard labor that he'd done to make all these achievements and then come work for National Institutes of Health, and just looking in his eyes, wondering, what is he thinking at this time? And you just can't help retroactively trying to interpret the feelings of this individual who literally went for years seemingly manipulating data and working towards a story, potentially an error, notably an error, that might have been propagating falsehoods. And from that point, building a base for so much science that so many folks had depended on in their research labs, in clinics, and then when it comes down to companies, drug companies, and patients that are looking for hope. And that really is immense. But I think at that time, I want to step back and I literally want to take a moment of silence. You think about the wrongdoing and the extreme criminality potentially of what this was. I just can't help but think to sort of rewind all the way back to the beginning as to how and why this had started and what type of impacts, if there was no anticipation whatsoever. And you have to start thinking, where is the psychology of this coming from? Is it that I'm going to do these things, I won't be caught, and he doesn't even process this sort of psychologically? Or if he does understand the risks and it just became this monstrous avalanche of fraud basing on more fraud, essentially for years and then even decades. It's really hard to comprehend, but at this moment, I can't help but feel immense sadness, along with a lot of anger and frustration and disbelief. All right. But at the same time, do I say there's disbelief? There's disbelief that it had gone on for so long. And where are the checks and balances, and where are the systems that are supposed to come into play to really help protect a system? Does the system protect itself? Or is this something that we as scientists have to make sure we're doing, specifically when it comes to peer review and whatnot? And I'm going to talk about this a bit more, but I really literally want to take a moment of silence right now here for Masliah himself. I think in the end, what has come to fruition is the worst possible thing that could have happened, and it should have happened, and it should have happened sooner. But I want a moment of silence to go all the way back to when the decision was made to even begin this path. That's the first reason. The second reason, for all of you that have been impacted by this, every human being, whether you're a direct researcher, whether you're a patient, whether you're a clinician, but no matter what, if you had hope, you had investment in all this stuff, it's just immensely sad. And I can actually feel emotional about it. Let's take a moment of silence just to step back and think about the types of impacts this has had and so much of the negative. And we need to find a way to engage this and to address these issues. And it doesn't matter what your science is. It doesn't matter what your work is. It doesn't matter what the topic is. Let's just pause and recenter for just a moment. So the first thing that scientists will rush to say, and people on the outside, non-scientists, might not think about so much on their own, is the real question: who's responsible? Where did this come from? Where were the peers? Where were the reviewers for grants and for papers? But the peers and the collaborators and individuals working on stories and publications coming out and co-authors, there is such an immense system of quote unquote checks and balances that play through this, that drive these things forward, that are supposed to provide these control mechanisms to give the best science possible and to help find the truth. You're trying to help the authors of proposals and papers to produce the best product, the most reliable information. But obviously that system crashes, and that system is dependent on people. Readers of these articles, at some point, I think every scientist needs to sit down to say, am I biased when I look at a title? Am I biased when I look at the journal? Am I biased when I look at the author? When I first interviewed for a contractor position with the government, the program manager I was interviewing with asked me, what's your favorite part of a paper to read? Something to that effect, or maybe it was the most important part of the paper that you like to read when you read a paper. I looked at him square in the eyes. I said, the data. I don't care about the abstract. I don't care about what they call in the results. I don't care in the discussion. The data. I want to see the data. I want to see how the data was broken down. And my second most important part of a paper is probably the materials and methods. And maybe some of you agree with that or not, but it really kind of comes down to how you're interpreting, this information that's brought forth. And now we have to ask these questions. How reliable is it? Now I'm going back to the question, who's responsible? Do we say the whole community? To a degree, yes. To a degree, the entire community holds some responsibility. Different members obviously being more responsible than others. And I'm not talking to you, the new graduate student or the experienced graduate student or the postdoc that, folks out there have been trying to follow up on alpha-synuclein or follow up on tau proteins. Again, I know people in this world and the hope and the dreams and following through on the basis of science that Masliah built. But there's folks out there that have been fighting it. There have been folks out there that don't necessarily believe what they're seeing and might have had their own hypotheses, and they've been rejected and turned out and turned over. And right? You've got those in agreement and those not in agreement and towards those hypotheses. And these are really important questions to ask. But the point is, who's responsible? And in a way, we have to accept that humans are subjective. That's what this boils down to oftentimes. And from the top down, there are a lot of people that played roles in this unfortunate situation. And to call out a reader of a journal article as being responsible is really frustrating. But I'll say, I think it speaks to something very, very important that I will emphasize many times throughout the series. We have to have courage to be able to know what we see is wrong, or to not have fear to come forth to admit, I don't like this. This just doesn't feel right to me. And, a hat tip to the folks out there that weren't convinced by some of the things that they saw or all the things they saw, and they pushed on it and they published their own data and they wrote their own proposals and they probably got rejected, right? I mean, that is an immense challenge in science, and we're going to talk more and more about that. But the question of who's responsible, obviously we know Masliah is responsible for this, but at the same time, we have to ask that question. What about the entire ecosystem of how this works? Well, guess what? It boils down to you. It really does. It boils down to us as individuals. And as I've said, you're a new grad student and you're frustrated and things are failing. Your hypothesis isn't right. You know what? How we build this system up has to come down from each and every individual involved with it. It's far from an isolated incident. It's gone on and on. And so for my non-scientist listeners, it permeates so much in science, but it permeates so much in the entire world, right? No big surprise there. The need to win, the need to be right. This is a matter of control that as scientists, writing hypothetical checks essentially, that they simply should not be cashing. Because how far does your prevailing correct hypothesis take you before the data and the science and the truth of your system tells you, it dictates that it must be revised? And this is just absolutely the case. We put the cart so far ahead of the horse because we get married to these beliefs and we're getting funding for it. We got to fall down that pathway. And then suddenly we are inflexible to seeing where that system takes us. And that's immensely frustrating and it's immensely frightening because I think anybody that looks from the outside in at a scientist or doing science is we need to go where the truth takes us. But so often this endeavor doesn't permit us to do that. How the system's even built is based on, data upon data upon data. And you get some promising result. And individuals at times say, well, guess what? I'm going to take that result and run with it. I still believe in it. And experiments aren't working out, but I'm going to take that data. I'm going to massage it in a way where it makes it follow through and present the dream idea that I've had that I've been pursuing forever. And it's a really hard, painful context to accept, but it's absolutely true. And I think what becomes very difficult is science as an institute and review and all these processes. These are not isolated in vacuums. They have tremendous influence on each other. And we take a moment of silence for any far-fetched, strong, hardworking scientists that have been in this game forever. I think about folks that going all the way back to it, thinking about the beginnings, those of you that are starting and hurting and it's so painful and things aren't working out for you. And yet that's where you have to start. That's where you have to begin doing this right and not being afraid to be wrong. So some parting thoughts. We're going to be covering so much that centralizes around these types of themes in forthcoming episodes. Where you should be starting as a new researcher or where you should be resetting as an experienced scientist. We all need to change, right? We need to think about changing convention and to grasp, no, not just to grasp, to embrace the fact that science and discovery is not ultimately controllable to be what we want. It is in control of us. And the best we can do is relinquish any idea that we have eminent domain and controlling power over that domain. We need to reset ourselves fully in that way. And I feel like at times, so many individuals get so caught up in it. It's such a challenge. It's so painful. And because it's so much about failure over and over and over. And it's a luring drug. Sorry for the expression. That's success and that need. And once you've built success, how do you maintain that? And you lose flexibility. So, these are things that we're going to really harp on more and more. And the types of topics that I hope to cover, I want all of you to feel courage. I don't want you to feel discouraged. It is so discouraging, but you can't give in to what you see is happening. And you have to keep believing in that mission as you drive forward towards knowing what the truth is, revealing the truth, peeling back the onion, getting back to those layers and finding the way as you go through each new success, each win, defining it. And, keeping on that straight path to remaining flexible and finding what that truth is and hopefully bringing you some great success in that regard. So we will make discoveries. We're going to find ways to use them effectively and productively. But we have to believe anyone that has some kind of imminent power, if they start to think, I can call it as I see it, to the point where I can create a story and I'm going to now fit data in to my belief, even if that data has to come from improper sources or certain alterations. That is an immensely dangerous path. And guess what? You're going to be caught. The tools are out there. Artificial intelligence is out there now. Images are being scanned. We're going to talk about a lot of those challenges and the impediments to it, to the process of how we can really be faithful to true science. So I'm going to conclude with this. It all begins with you. Keep the courage, even with hearing this kind of news, so that you can do it right. And it's really up to you to help save science and research. And this does take courage because it frees you from having to be what we want to call right every single time. We'll discuss right versus wrong in a forthcoming episode and more coming from that point as well. But thanks so much for joining me, and we'll cover some more topics as well. So all of you hang in there, keep your head up, have a good one. Continuing 30 years of experience with stories in and beyond the academic realm, Antithesis is a podcast that will take these perspectives and philosophies and pull them, along with you, the student, the researcher, the innovator, the educator, into the sunlight. Join us for some firsthand experiences, insights from inside and outside academia, and perspectives that are aimed at redefining the conventions of academia and your training, with the aim of helping you reorient your compass and strengthen you on your journey forward, or to recover and grow from those times past. We'd love to have you follow us and tune in weekly. If you have a topic you'd like discussed or a challenge you are facing you want to share, email us at allsystemsgo@gmail.com. That is ALLSYST3MSGO@gmail.com.